Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, as always, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hey, John, how are you?
I'm doing all right. It's good to be back in the swing of things with our normal schedule. I think, actually a busy schedule to start off the year, really, but it's nice to be back in the thick of writing and getting things ready for the club and sharing all the things that we've been kind of planning and plotting over the holidays. I mean, we've got a lot more coming up later in the year, but this Friday we got a special club issue, which is one of the first things that you and I talked about. So it's nice to kind of actually roll some of that stuff out.
Yeah, it's always a fun time of the year in that I have so many ideas for things I want to read about on the site and in the newsletters. And then I realize just how short days really are. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with all of these ideas? And so it's always fun because it's, coming back from the holiday break, you want to write about a bunch of topics, but then you also got to prioritize. So hopefully we will be able to keep a steady stream of new articles, new series, new sections, new types of app stories episodes, all kinds of content. We are content creators, John, if you're not aware.
I think that's right. All right. Well, that's cool. All right. So today, Federico, we have a special shortcuts topic because we haven't talked about shortcuts in a little while. And what I thought would be really cool to talk about are third-party shortcuts supporting apps. What do you call these? Shortcuts utilities, maybe? I don't know what the best name for these things is.
Yeah, maybe shortcuts utilities is what I call them. There really isn't a proper name for them at this point. Shortcuts-based apps doesn't really give you the idea of what I mean. Shortcuts utilities, I guess, it is the best way to describe them. Basically, this idea of the ecosystem of third-party apps surrounding shortcuts and heavily based on shortcuts, not just in terms of apps that offer shortcuts integration, because you could argue that Things and OmniFocus and any app that really offers a shortcut is integrated with shortcuts. But what we're talking about are utilities that make sense only and mostly when used alongside shortcuts, because they are meant to supercharge your shortcuts experience. That would be the idea, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And before we get there, we've got, 3 apps and I guess 1 beta to kind of run through. I want to do a brief aside about terminology when you talk about shortcuts, because, I don't want to be really pedantic about this and be
wait. You mean we are releasing our style guide publicly? Is that what we're doing?
something like that. This is not quite the Mac Stories style guide, but I do think that using the terminology correctly is important because I think it leads to a lot of confusion when people call things the wrong thing. And I see it in a lot of quarters. I even see developers in their release notes and things calling different things the wrong thing, and that
I see Apple calling different things the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's true too. Well, I was just about to say I kind of put this one at the feet of Apple because they have there's a lot of terminology that means a lot of different things in different contexts, which makes it confusing. So I don't blame people for not getting it right. It's not easy, but I thought maybe we ought to just quickly run through what we're talking about, and that, I think, sets the table pretty well for talking about these third-party shortcuts. And the first thing, I want to start easy. I want to start with shortcuts with a capital S.
Okay.
Because that's the app. That's not the automations that you create with the app. Those are also shortcuts, but with a little s.
Lowercase, yes.
Right, lowercase. That's probably the easiest part of this whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
I want to really pick your brain about this, because the one that's been driving me crazy a little bit that I think is the hardest to explain is Siri Shortcuts. Right? Because we've had things like Siri Intents for quite a long time. I think that was iOS 10. And then in 12, we got the ability to add things to Siri. And we got the terminology of Siri Shortcuts. But a Siri Shortcut, to me, Siri Shortcuts, it's, first of all, you can look and find these things in the Apple Style Guide, which was updated in December. And it has an entry about Siri Shortcuts. And it is always pluralized, and it is a feature, not a thing. So it's a feature. It's part of what Shortcuts is, I think, is how I describe it, but it's not the actual actions necessarily that are created with it. Do you agree with that, or am I getting it wrong?
100%. So Siri Shortcuts they basically refer to the ability for apps to donate a shortcut. And that shortcut you may be able to associate with Siri by giving it a custom phrase. I guess the confusion stems from the fact that Apple made a bit of a mess last year with iOS 12 when they introduced,
Right.
well, not last year, 2 years ago at this point, 2018, when they introduced shortcuts. They were sort of using the terminology shortcuts and Siri shortcuts interchangeably. But if you actually looked in the documentation, it was clear that Shortcuts was the app and Siri Shortcuts was the ability for apps to donate a single shortcut and make it available in the assistant with a custom phrase. So,
right.
So I was talking, so a while ago, I was talking to some friends who work at Apple, and they explained to me why shortcuts, the confusion between it's called a shortcut and it runs in the Shortcuts app. And I basically, in this conversation, I said, well, it's sort of like before when it was called workflow, it was a workflow inside workflow. And it was funny that they mentioned how now it's better because now you can say a shortcut's shortcut instead of a workflow. There's just a tiny difference between the two words.
Okay.
That somehow, according to them, makes it better.
I don't know about that, Federico. That seems a little thin to me.
I know it's literally a single character, but in any case, I think it is. If we are to offer our style guide publicly, I hereby declare that calling the app or just generically speaking shortcuts that you create Siri Shortcuts is wrong, because Siri Shortcuts refers to the ability for apps to donate a shortcut to Siri. What really bothers me is how so many people, including Apple sometimes, refers to either the full app as Siri Shortcuts or any shortcut that you manually create in the Shortcuts app. It's like, and I thought about this, why does this bother me so much? Because I if you listen to Connected, you know that I have a bit of a problem with people calling, things with the wrong names. But that's not necessarily it. What really bothers me is that imagine if instead of just calling it the iPhone, I would start saying the Apple iPhone. Like imagine if every single time, yes, the Apple iPhone. Obviously, it's an Apple iPhone, and obviously Shortcuts can work with Siri, but Siri Shortcuts is not the name. The name of the app is Shortcuts.
It's a little bit like calling it the Macintosh Professional, I think.
Well, that's a very good name, though. So that's also a reference.
It is
good job.
All right.
We should also clarify the difference between actions and parameters.
Yeah, and one thing I want to mention right off the top about actions is that I think that this feeds in part into the confusion about Siri Shortcuts, in that when a shortcut is donated to the Shortcuts app using Siri Shortcuts, it's oftentimes, or maybe all the time, a single action shortcut. So there's this overlap between actions and shortcuts, where sometimes your shortcut really is just a single action, but it's an action that's wrapped. It's action wrapped in a shortcut, right?
Yeah, it is still an action. So shortcuts are always made of actions, even if it's just one, still an action. Right. A shortcut is a container for actions. The action alone is not the shortcut. The shortcut is also the name of the shortcut, the types of inputs that a shortcut can receive. The action is the primary building block for a shortcut. Sure, the action is what you drag in from the action library into the shortcuts editor. Those are actions. Parameters are a feature of actions. Parameters, so if the action is the building block, the parameter is a tiny part of that. Basically, parameters are the easiest way to understand this, really, is to look at any shortcut in iOS 13, look at an action. If it's got a blue empty token that looks like a text field, That's a parameter. A parameter is a piece of data that passes input or can be used to configure an action. It's a parameter. It's a tiny customizable piece of data that lives inside of an action. And it didn't used to be this way before. Not all actions were based on parameters, and the parameter framework is all new in iOS 13. And of course, right in the latest OS, there's the ability for developers to support parameters, to exchange data back and forth with shortcuts. That is new this year. Wasn't possible for developers before. So now if you look at, for example, the add to do action for things, it is chock full of parameters. All the customizable fields for the task name, the due date, the project, the area, the notes, all of those are parameters. Parameters are used to configure actions. But again, the actions are the primary building blocks of a shortcut. Also, this is maybe kind of slightly related. Automations that you create in the Shortcuts app, technically, every shortcut is an automation. But I guess we need to differentiate between automation as a concept and automation as a feature. The Shortcuts app as an automations section. It is labeled automations.
Right.
That lets you configure shortcuts that can run based on different types of triggers. Those can be time of day triggers, location triggers, accessory, whether you open an app, whether you turn off an alarm clock. Those are labeled officially the product name. It is automations. But yes, I'm aware that technically speaking and conceptually speaking, any shortcut is an automation. What Apple means is these are shortcuts that run automatically. That's why they're called automations. They're called automations also because in HomeKit, the same feature is also called automations. It is something that runs on its own based on a schedule or based on different triggers.
Right. All right. Well, that's good. I mean, we should mention super fast too, I think, variables, because
yes.
you can still set and get your own variables, but now you can also, magic variables have been a thing for quite a while now in shortcuts, and magic variables are like temporary bits of information that are passed out of an action and are available for you to use in another step of your shortcut. So magic ones are created, they're magic because they're kind of automatically created and exist and are there in the shortcut without you having to do anything. You can just use them. And regular old lowercase variables are something you can also do, but you don't really have to do very often any longer because of the magic variables, right?
Yes. So basically the idea would be that they're called magic variables because they exist magically. You don't need to manually create them. And the idea, and this was introduced back in the days of workflow, the idea is that any action produces a result. And that result, that output is by default a magic variable. And you can access magic variables by tapping the magic wand icon in the Shortcuts editor. So you don't need to manually set a variable. And I mean, we can talk about like what's a variable, but that's a very, this is not a show about programming. But basically the idea would be that a variable is a feature that lets you hold data for later. Basically, it's a way to save a piece of data to be reused later in a shortcut. And magic variables sort of abstract this complexity for you of having to create variables, because they're always magically created behind the scenes by shortcuts. And again, you can access them. There's a button in shortcuts. It looks like a magic wand icon, and you can tap that and it opens a view that shows you these little tokens. Those are the magic variables.
Yes. Okay. I think that's enough teaching for the day. Teaching with Teachy, right? I mean,
yes.
It's a good place to start though, because especially the conversation we just had about actions and parameters come into play immediately with the first app that we want to talk about, and that is Toolbox Pro. Because Toolbox Pro, I mean, I guess the way I would describe it is that it's an app that fills in a lot of the holes in Shortcuts itself, because not all of the system things that can be done with Apple's APIs are built into Shortcuts itself. But what Toolbox Pro does is it's taken a lot of those developer APIs and turn them into a collection of actions that you can incorporate into your shortcuts and modify using the parameters that are available. And so, this launched last fall in November. You wrote about it, you did the review, and at the time there were over 50 actions in the app. But now it's closing in on 100. It's pretty amazing. It's been, Alex Hay, who makes this app, has been working really hard on it and updating it very regularly, and it's made a big difference. I mean, especially, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about MusicBot because, as it was originally conceived, MusicBot was going to be a little more complicated, at least on the pro side for club members, because we didn't have what was available in Toolbox Pro, but Toolbox Pro actually simplified it quite a bit, didn't it?
Yes. So for MusicBot Pro, so before I get to MusicBot Pro though, really the easiest way to think of Toolbox is as a container for actions. Those actions you can only use in the Shortcuts app. There are some features that you can access in Toolbox Pro, the app. For instance, you can manage global variables. These are basically a way for you to store data in iCloud and retrieve that data. It can be text, can be JSON content via an action. But really, Toolbox Pro is about 197, I believe, at this point. It started out with 50 or something, so it got a lot of updates in the meantime. Toolbox Pro is a container for actions, and those actions you can find inside of the Shortcuts app. For MusicBot, which is my Apple Music assistant powered by Shortcuts, Toolbox simplified a lot of work and actually made MusicBot Pro possible. I don't know if I would have done MusicBot Pro in the end if I didn't have Toolbox, because it comes with actions that integrate with the Apple Music Web API and remove all of the complexity necessary to interact with the Apple Music API, which includes creating, for example, a developer token and having to manage results that come back from the Apple Music web service as dictionaries, as JSON content. It's that's the whole point of Toolbox Pro, of making it possible for you to do more things with shortcuts without having to do that the manual way, the developer way. Because I could have integrated with Apple Music myself, and I did it. I mean, we talked about it in an issue of Mac Stories Weekly. But the point is, thanks to Toolbox Pro's Apple Music actions, MusicBot Pro can now do things like searching the entire Apple Music catalog for any song, any artist, any album, or loving or disliking a song. This is not possible with Shortcuts alone. Doesn't come with that kind of Apple Music integration. Or, for example, being able to start playback of music that is not saved in your library, but just music that is available on the Apple Music service, and starting playback in the Music app for the iPhone and iPad. Again, that's not possible because Shortcuts alone, it can only process music that you've also manually saved to your library. But a lot of people don't do that anymore. A lot of people just search and stream, and they don't save albums or singles or playlists to their libraries anymore. So this idea of you can work with a web API, but you don't have to worry about anything else. You don't have to see the raw data. You don't have to care about authentication. Toolbox Pro takes care of that for you. And not only that, but the results that it provides you with inside of Shortcuts are actual rich variables. And you can access multiple properties for each variable. And you never look at any code. It's always done the visual way, the Shortcuts way, with actions, with variables. So, for example, if you search for a song using these actions, you can tap on the song variable and you can say, well, I don't want the song, I want the title, or I want the name of the artist, or maybe I want the artwork as an image, or maybe I want the URL of this song on Apple Music. So all these different sort of properties contained within a variable. That's also possible thanks to these actions. So the idea of Toolbox Pro, I think, is a genius one. And honestly, and I say this against my own benefit, but honestly, Alex should work at Apple. Should be on the Shortcuts team, because what he's been able to, hire Alex and let him work on actions, because what he's been able to achieve using the parameters framework is just incredible. And he's a single person working on all these actions. And it's really remarkable, like, because beyond what I just mentioned for Apple Music and beyond global variables and other integrations that Toolbox Pro has, it also comes with a lot of quality of life type of improvements, simple actions that just do things that are so obvious, but that are still missing from shortcuts. And I mean things like you have a list of items, like 1, 2, 3, and you want to reverse that list to say 3, 2, 1. That's not possible by default in shortcuts. There's no reverse list action. It's something so obvious. It's like, I mean, come on, Apple didn't make this action? No, they didn't actually make one. But Toolbox Pro has one. And that is just one of the 30-something examples of all these little small utilities that Toolbox Pro has, and that really, I think it's a genius idea.
One of the things that I find super helpful with Toolbox Pro is its handling of regex, because regular expressions are really complicated. I've never been good at them, and you don't.
Nobody really is, except John Gruber, I guess.
Right, and you don't really have to deal with that as much because it's abstracted away. A lot of the kinds of things you would do commonly with regular expressions are just simple actions in Toolbox Pro. And if you haven't checked it out yet, I mean, it is really easy to get started because there's a free version that has some of the actions that you can use for free. And if it really catches on with you, you pay for the pro version and it unlocks all of the actions. And all you have to do, it's just like, it's like dealing with any other third-party app when you're in Shortcuts. When you want to add an action that is a Toolbox Pro action, you just go to the app section of Shortcuts and tap on the Toolbox Pro one and browse through all the actions that it offers. It couldn't be simpler. And I think you're right about especially about Alex. Apple probably would be smart to hire him. I think that's kind of true about all these apps. These are all single developer apps, and they're all the kinds of features that we'd love to see built into Shortcuts ultimately too. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. They have 11 data centers worldwide, including their latest center in Sydney, Australia. And with their enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a surprisingly good price. Get started with Linode today with a $20 credit for listeners of this show. Native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and industry-leading processors. A revamped cloud manager built on an open-source single-page app. Root access to your server along with API version 4 and a Python CLI. Nanode plans starting as low as $5. And a whole lot more. Go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code appstories2020 when creating a new Linode account and get $20 off your next project. Oh, and Linode are hiring right now too. So if that's something that interests you, go to linode.com/careers to find out more. Again, that URL for the $20 credit is linode.com/appstories, and the promo code is appstories2020. Our thanks to Linode for their support of App Stories.
So why don't we talk about this other one, Pushcut? What is Pushcut, John?
All right. So, we talked about Toolbox Pro, and that is really about actions and parameters and that sort of thing. Pushcut takes a different angle at expanding what you can do with shortcuts, and that is creating a notification-based shortcut triggers. And so what I mean by that is you can configure really complex push notifications that come to you and allow you to fire off shortcuts. And this is useful for a bunch of different reasons, but it has integrations with, it's got interactivity. We've had rich notifications for a while on iOS, and it takes advantage of that, allowing you to have buttons and lists and things in the notification itself. So all you have to do, if you want to have an option when a certain trigger happens to fire off one of multiple different shortcuts, you can do that. You can just create buttons for each shortcut you might want to potentially trigger and tap it and it fires off. And it works with web APIs. So there's webhook integration, so you can use it with things like Zapier and IFTTT. It works with home automation. One of the first things I did with this app was to extend what you can do in the automations part of the home app, because if you go into automations, you can create a shortcut of sorts in the home app. It doesn't have all the actions that are available in the full-on Shortcuts app, and that creates a bit of an issue because it limits what you can accomplish. So what I did was I created a Pushcut that when I turn off my lights in my studio, it sends the notification to me, and I can then tap on the notification and fire off a shortcut that turns off my Mac. That's all it does. It's really simple, but I always forget to kind of turn off the screen or to turn off my Mac when I leave the room. And this way, I can either, if I already did it, I can ignore the notification. If I haven't done it, I can tap the notification, and it runs a shortcut that integrates with the Remote for Mac iOS app. Now, you cannot do that. You cannot use that shortcut in the home app itself, but because there are webhooks, I'm able to send myself a notification that allows me to jump directly into Shortcuts and run that notification based on a home automation trigger. Do you follow me?
Yeah, I do. That's very cool.
Yeah, you've got one yourself, don't you? Don't you use Pushcuts with your Dyson fan?
Yeah, I do. I wrote about this on the site and the club. I use Pushcut to basically send me notification when the room temperature has reached a certain level, and if it did, the notification has buttons to disable the heating mode of the Dyson fan, or just turn it off altogether. And both of these buttons, both of these actions that are available for this notification are actually HomeKit scenes, because that's something that Pushcut can do. It lets you trigger HomeKit scenes from notifications, and they run in the background from the notification itself. So that's very cool. I've implemented Pushcut recently. I was doing a bit of a cleanup of my Zapier account. So something that I do now is I get a notification whenever a video has been downloaded on my Mac Mini using YouTube DL and uploaded to my Dropbox account, which I use as a mirror for these videos. Normally they are saved on an external drive where my Plex library is also available, but I also save a duplicate copy in my Dropbox account just as an additional mirror. And I get a Zapier notification, and I get a Pushcut notification when a video is available in Dropbox via Pushcut, because Pushcut has an official channel on Zapier that you can enable. And that notification has a button. I actually talked about this on the latest episode of Adapt. It's got a button that lets me watch that video in the VLC player app with just one tap. It loads a VLC URL scheme that loads the video directly from my Dropbox account. So that's very cool. And also now I'm using Pushcut to act as a bridge between Trello and reminders. So I have this other Zapier automation that whenever I add a label named reminders to a card in my Trello account, it sends me a Pushcut notification. And that notification has a button that launches Shortcuts, and Shortcuts creates a reminder for that Trello card. It uses the name of the card and the link of the card, and if available, a due date. So the due date from Trello is also used as a due date in reminders. So this idea of using Pushcut and Shortcuts as a connection between the Trello web service and reminders on my local device. So yeah, I mean, I love Pushcut. It's super cool. It's, again, another pro feature that Apple should do, ideally. Like push notifications, yes, why not? But I realize it's a very niche feature, and of all the apps that we're covering today, there's another one. Honestly, I think Pushcut is, in terms of potential Sherlocking down the road, I think Pushcut is the one that should be safe, because I honestly don't see Apple releasing a web service, a customizable web service for sending push notifications and, integration with Zapier and IFTTT. So I think of all these utilities, Pushcut probably won't be Sherlocked in the future.
Yeah, that's probably right. It's probably worth mentioning too that you can trigger these, a push notification based on things like time and location and iBeacon triggers too. I mean, we've talked a little bit about home automation triggers and similar things, but those are available as well. So there's a lot. Once it's something that I try to do with all of these apps that we're talking about is when I run into a roadblock in Shortcuts, if I can't figure out how to do it, I start looking, poking around these apps, because very often you'll find that there's a way to kind of bridge the gap using one of these. And that's kind of the beauty of each one of them. I want to talk about probably the most recent addition to this list, which is LaunchCuts, which you reviewed on the site last week and talked about a little bit on Connected as well. So maybe we don't need to cover it in quite as much depth, but I want to hear a little bit more about how you're using it and let people know, I guess, what it can allow them to accomplish if they add it to their Shortcuts library.
LaunchCuts is basically a better way to organize your shortcuts using folders, which is the big missing feature from the Shortcuts app, but also other tools such as advanced search or the ability to sort your shortcuts by name, by color, by icon, and even by size. So LaunchCuts, when you look at it, you look at a couple of screenshots and it looks just like the default grid view for the Shortcuts app. Right. And it contains all of your shortcuts with the same colors, with the same icons, with the same order that you normally have in the Shortcuts app. And this is possible because LaunchCuts can scan the contents of your Shortcuts library and sort of create a mirror of all your shortcuts. And funnily enough, this is done through a shortcut. LaunchCuts gets this data using a shortcut that is called LaunchCuts Helper. There's a guided setup process the first time you install the app, so it guides you through all of the necessary steps to do this. Obviously, LaunchCuts cannot actually run or edit shortcuts for you. It is basically a fancy launcher for those shortcuts. It uses the same look, uses the same appearance, but it can only open the Shortcuts app. That said, there's plenty of utility, at least for me, in just being able to organize my shortcuts and create folders for my shortcuts and sort of break them up in, by theme, for example. So like all my reminders shortcuts go in one folder and all my time tracking shortcuts go in another folder. Again, these folders, it's not like they show up in the Shortcuts app, because the Shortcuts app cannot be customized by third-party developers. These folders appear in the LaunchCuts app, which is, once again, a launcher. So basically what I'm doing is, instead of tapping the Shortcuts icon when I want to find the shortcut that I need to run or that I want to modify, I tap on the LaunchCuts icon instead. And then I tap on a shortcut, and it takes me to the editor for that specific shortcut in the Shortcuts app. It's a better way to launch and organize your shortcuts. Very, very likely that Apple is going to Sherlock this app in the future if they do add, and they really should, but I guess the developer didn't want to wait. And I think it's a good idea, because maybe Apple will do it at WWDC, maybe not. But I do think it's a kind of utility that could be Sherlocked by Apple if Apple were ever to say, okay, now you can create folders for your shortcuts, and you can customize the grid, and you can sort in a couple of additional ways. That said, it's super cool. LaunchCuts is really well done. Supports iPad multi-window, so you can open different folders in different windows. You can run LaunchCuts and shortcuts side by side in split view, and you can, especially if you need to edit multiple shortcuts at a time, it's perfect for that. So if you can tap on a shortcut on one side and it opens on the other side, and you can do so multiple times in a row, and it just switches instantly. Super well done.
Yeah, that to me is kind of the killer way to use this, because if you're on a phone or something, you will be kind of having to bounce back and forth if you're dealing with multiple shortcuts. And the smart folders are really neat because there's so many different ways you can organize and filter and sort all of your shortcuts. It's, what the app is doing is it's actually looking at the underlying XML that comprises a shortcut and pulling out bits of data that it can use to actually sort these things, which is super clever. I'm not sure whether that's something that's going to last long term or not, whether that's you mentioned in your article, whether that's something that Apple closes that aspect off to third parties or not in the future. I hope not, because even if Apple ends up doing folders and sorting and filtering, I'm not so sure that what we'll get from Apple will be quite as extensive as what we're seeing in LaunchCuts. Federico, before we finish up the show for this week, I want to preview an app that's coming from our friend Simon Stovring called Data Jar. It's still in beta, but he's been involving a lot of people in the Shortcuts community in developing this. I'm not sure when it's coming out yet, but you've been playing around with it more than me, and it's really intriguing to me because it's basically a database app that creates a way to store data that persists between sessions and can be used by multiple shortcuts. So you can create a data store that you can access whether you're in one shortcut or another. What kinds of things have you been playing with to try to figure out how this app works?
So Data Jar, and I really cannot wait for this utility to come out. It takes the idea of global variables from Toolbox Pro to the next level by letting you create global variables of all types, of all kinds, not just text, but text, images, PDF documents, all kinds of objects can become variables. Global variables that you can access from any shortcut using the Data Jar action. It's really well done. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around until you see it. But basically, it's a container of data, structured data, that can be, you can create single item variables, but you can also create lists. So like a variable that contains multiple lists of items. Like, say you want to create a global variable called images, and inside that collection, there's multiple photos. And all of these pieces of data, you can access on all of your devices using native actions inside of the Shortcuts app. So it's a way for you to store data and use that data across multiple shortcuts instead of having to, say, for example, use iCloud Drive or store your files in Dropbox. And not only can you retrieve this data, but you can also update the contents of data that is stored in Data Jar. And you can delete items, you can update lists. It's really well done. It's like a clipboard manager, but exposed as actions, as a container of data in Shortcuts. I plan to build a bunch of cool things with this utility. I hope it comes out. It's still in the very early stages in test flight. And I do hope it's one of the apps that we'll see from Simon in 2020. I think there's a lot of potential for this kind of app. There's a lot of cool things that it could do in terms of like how you can store content and how you can preview content inside of Data Jar. So I really hope that this goes beyond the beta stage and that it becomes a commercial product, because it is an excellent example of what can be done with parameters and actions and CloudKit and all these new technologies in combination with shortcuts.
Yeah, it's far more sophisticated than just saving bits of data in iCloud Drive. So it not only lets you do all the things that you said, but it's a way to kind of simplify some shortcuts too, I think, because you can outboard your data in Data Jar and have it available to you to access without having, I don't know, say like a really long text action with a whole bunch of text in it, just because you want persistent access to that text every time you run the shortcut.
That's correct.
It opens up a lot of possibilities. So that is definitely one that I want to be playing with a little bit more. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to talk about, Federico? I think that's a nice roundup of the premier Pro shortcuts apps that are out there. I really hope that Apple's watching these kind of apps really closely because we've kind of brought shortcuts to the masses, so to speak, by building it into the system. You know, when Apple decided to make it a system app, not one that you had to download separately, and building in Siri support and so forth, I think that Apple made the app a lot more accessible to average users. But I want to see some more power user features kind of built in as we head towards iOS 14.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's part of a bigger conversation that we should have before WWDC about what's the identity of shortcuts at this point.
Yes.
Where is shortcuts going now? Is it going the power user direction? Is it going the simplification way? Is Apple going to simplify even more and try to make it more accessible to the masses? Can it be both at the same time? So that's part of a bigger discussion around the balance of shortcuts and the role of shortcuts. What should it become? What does Apple want out of shortcuts? But I think, it's January. I think we can talk about it in a couple of months before WWDC.
Yeah.
We'll see. In theory, we should be getting at least another, the usual spring update to iOS 13. I guess iOS 13.4, maybe? So we'll see if there's any shortcuts updates in there.
Yeah, that would be great. All right, Federico. Well, that is a good place to stop for this week. I want to thank our sponsor again. That's Linode. And as usual, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico's on Twitter and Instagram. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.